Okay, so we are going to be working on chapter 5 now. It's going to be the cardiovascular system. And so when we take a look at the cardiovascular system, there's different parts of it. And so we'll just kind of get, first of all, an overview of the cardiovascular system, take a look at the heart and the blood vessels. So let's first of all take a look and just kind of ease ourselves into the cardiovascular system. There's a lot going on. It's a very, very important system. And so we want to make sure that we get good coverage of it. So the cardiovascular system is essentially predominantly going to be made up of your heart and your blood vessels. The heart is essentially a pump that will pump the blood through your blood vessels, and its job is to bring nutrients to the cells and oxygen and things of that nature. It also is supposed to exchange substances like waste and things like that, and it'll take waste away from the tissues itself. And so it has two parts. It delivers nutrients, necessary nutrients, and it'll take away waste. Now, when you take a look at the cardiovascular system, it basically kind of permeates all the other systems. So it's a really, really important system. You've got miles of blood vessels going through your body, and the job of those blood vessels is to bring these necessary nutrients, basically supplies for living, to your cells. If you don't have blood, you can't live. If your cells don't have the nutrients that they need from the blood, then they simply can't live. And so this is important because when you cut blood off to a part of a body, basically it'll become necrotic. Basically, they'll starve to death, and those cells will die. And so, for instance, when you take a look at gas exchange, so one of the things that the cardiovascular system does, it takes oxygen from the respiratory system. So as you breathe in oxygen, it'll pick that up, and then it will bring that to the tissues, which need oxygen in order to do metabolism. And then their byproduct is going to be carbon dioxide. So really, when you go through the lungs, the blood is picking up oxygen and dumping off carbon dioxide. So picking up the nutrients and then dumping off the waste. Now, when you take a look at nutrition, so when you eat something, basically you digest it, you absorb it into your bloodstream, and then that nutrition, those nutrients, will then enter into your body by way of the digestive system. And then once they absorbed into the bloodstream, into the intestines, then they are basically transported to the rest of the body's cells. And so before they do that, however, they have to go to the liver. We'll talk more about this in the digestive system. Where the liver will metabolize whatever you eat, and then essentially it will send these nutrients off to the body. So you can think of the liver as sort of like basically making sure that everything is safe for the rest of the body to consume. Now, at the kidneys, so here's another system. So your urinary system, the blood is basically sent through your kidneys through structures called nephrons, where your blood is cleaned out. So it's basically purified. You're getting rid of a lot of wastes. That is built up in, especially nitrogenous waste, that is basically built up in the blood itself as a byproduct of metabolism. And so basically you kind of bundle that up into a waste product, urine, essentially, that you want to get rid of. And so when you take a look at the function of the cardiovascular system, it's got multiple functions, but its big one is going to be transport. That's literally what it does. It's a transportation system. This is if you think of it in terms of economics, this is essentially a distribution system. So it distributes oxygen throughout the body. It collects carbon dioxide throughout the body and other waste products throughout the body. It delivers nutrients and hormones that you need in order for your cells to communicate with each other. And of course, immune cells, so that your immune cells can move from one place to the body so that they can fight infection. And so in your blood, you have your immune cells circulating, and you also have antibodies circulating, which are basically protein chemical signals that will essentially attack bacteria or any kind of an infection that doesn't belong in your body. Another function of the cardiovascular system is homeostasis. So we talked about a little bit about that in some of the earlier chapters. And so that maintaining of internal constant conditions so that you have some balance is homeostasis, and the cardiovascular system plays an important role there. For instance, temperature homeostasis, keeping your core body temperature the same. Blood is hot. and blood is cardiovascular system. So it has a lot to do with temperature balance, also pH balance. So your blood pH is roughly right around, your physiological pH is right around 7.4. And so in order to maintain this, your cardiovascular system is constantly having to adjust the pH to make sure that it stays at that 7.4. Your water balance, right? So making sure that you're good, well hydrated, and that your tissues in particular are well hydrated, and also that they're receiving the types of minerals and ions that they need in order to do their job. So you can see then that the cardiovascular system is not just transport, but it's also basically important in creating internal conditions. So your cells can thrive and work, do their job. That's what you want. This is kind of what it looks like, just a basic schematic. So here you can see, I'm going to switch to a different color so you can see it. So here you can see your heart. Your heart is basically going to pump the blood. It's going to go through the large vessels and through the lungs, where it's going to exchange. Can't really see that very well. It's going to exchange oxygen and CO2 at the lungs in the respiratory system. And then as it moves throughout the body, it's going to exchange oxygen for CO2 in the tissues, picking up CO2. And then in the kidneys, it's going to be filtered through the kidneys so that it can be cleaned out, get rid of some of that excess waste, those nitrogenous metabolic byproducts. And then as you go to the digestive system, it's going to be picking up nutrients that the liver has newly metabolized and made sure it's safe for everybody to consume. And then it goes back to the heart for redistribution throughout the rest of the body. So there's another kind of a partner to the cardiovascular system called the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is kind of like an alternative circulatory system. Where the cardiovascular circulatory system is a closed system, that means that the blood always stays inside the arteries, they're not open-ended. The lymphatic system is an open system, which basically means that the vessels, lymphatic vessels, actually just open up, and the lymph, the fluid, this basically just oozes out and sort of permeates all the tissues. And so this is an assister to the cardiovascular system. And what it basically does is it helps to regulate your tissue fluid. So keeping your tissues from swelling up with fluid, your lymphatic system acts like a sponge that mops up that excess tissue fluid, and it returns it back into the blood and back into the cardiovascular system. And so this this fluid in the lymph vessels typically is this interstitial fluid. That's the fluid around the cells, and it will enter into the lymphatic vessels, and we call it lymph at that particular point. Okay. Now let's take a look at the blood vessels. So then we'll of course take a look at the heart. So we have three main types of blood vessels. The first one is arteries. The second one is veins, and we have capillaries. Now, when you take a look at arteries, oftentimes it's confusing for students in terms of the direction of blood. But the important thing to remember is that arteries are always going away from the heart. Remember this. Arteries away, and you'll never go astray. So regardless of the color or how much oxygen is in them, arteries are always going away from the heart. Veins are always going toward the heart. And in capillaries, basically this is kind of like the physiological drop-off point. For the tissues, between the tissues and the blood. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here you can see some nice images here. This red one right here is an artery. You can tell it's an artery because arteries tend to have this very, very thick muscular wall, which you can kind of see here. And that's kind of part of its structure because it has a lot of high blood pressure in there. Veins, you can see, are typically much narrower. They don't have as thick a wall, and the lumen, or the inside, is big, whereas the lumen of the artery is small, typically. Now, between these two is a capillary bed. So typically what will happen is blood will come through the artery, and then as it's going through the artery, it'll move into the capillaries, and then from the capillaries, it'll basically move through, and then it'll exchange oxygen and CO2 and nutrients, and then it'll pick up the waste, and then it'll collect on the venous side in a structure called a venule, and then it'll dump into the venous system where it'll go back to the heart for another round of exchange. And so typically you can kind of see that the capillary bed is essentially this kind of large sort of fish network that's designed for exchange of nutrients and gases and things like that. And so the structure of the artery has a couple of walls. So let's start off with, first of all, with our artery. So they have 3 layers to their walls. The first one, the endothelium, is a thin inner epithelium. That means basically it's a little thin sheet of single cells, squamous flat cells that forms like the inner lining of the artery itself. Think of it as sort of like wallpaper on a wall. And then as we start to move from the endothelium, we get to the middle layer, which has smooth muscle and elastic tissue. This allows them to expand and recoil like a rubber band. So, and the reason why you have to do that is because it's under pressure from the heart. So the heart is just basically blasted a bunch of blood through there. So there's a lot of blood pressure going through there. So it has to be able to expand and recoil. And then you have your outer layer, which is a connective tissue layer. And this basically allows you to connect to other tissues. Now then, as we start to move from arteries, we're going to get smaller and smaller until we get to arterioles. Now, arterioles are small arteries. Mostly their middle layer, that muscular layer, has a smooth muscle in it, but that's mostly what it's got. It doesn't have a lot of that outer layer to it. And so its job is to contract and constrict the blood vessel, or to relax and dilate the blood vessel. So these two together, when you're kind of either constricting the blood vessel to reduce the diameter, or if you're relaxing the blood vessel to increase the diameter, this is what's called hold on a second. This one here is called vasoconstriction. And this is called vasodilation. So basically, your arterioles are constantly sort of constricting and dilating, changing their diameter. And what this does is it changes resistance. So these two together changes your resistance, which helps to regulate blood pressure. So oftentimes arterioles are referred to as the resistance vessels, because this is how you change your resistance. Now from arterioles, then you're going to be moving into the capillaries. Capillaries are really, really tiny. They're super, super tiny. And so essentially, when you see capillaries, they're only made up of endothelium. They're very, very narrow. And the capillary beds is basically where you get all of your exchange happening. You exchange your gases, your nutrients, and your waste. That's happening in the capillary beds. And the way that you regulate movement through the capillaries through a pair of muscles that you find at the openings to capillary entrances called precapillary sphincters. So these are basically muscles that essentially close off like an aperture, a capillary. And by that, you can control blood flow through it. So basically, if you do this, it controls your blood flow through the capillary. So for instance, if you close your capillary sphincter, then the blood will move somewhere else. And so if the blood flows through the center part, it's what's called an arteriovenous shunt. That's basically this long sort of this long thoroughfare, sometimes called a thoroughfare, vessel, but you can see these precapillary sphincters are like little wraps of muscle. So if they close off, and all of them close off the capillary entrances, then the blood just basically moves straight through the capillary bed without exchanging, and then goes right into the venous system. Okay, so that's what a shunt is. So now that we've gone through the capillary bed, then we're going to be collected by the venules. So at this point, the blood has delivered oxygen, picked up CO2, it's delivered nutrients, and now it's picking up waste. And so once it's picked up waste, then it is going to be moving that to the venous system. Basically, it's going to be moving into the venules where it collects the blood from the capillaries. And then from the venules, they'll drain into the veins. And then these will carry the blood toward the heart. Now, venules and veins have the same three layers the arteries do. However, they're slightly different. For instance, they have less smooth muscle in the middle layer. And not only that, but they have valves in them to keep the blood flowing forward. So for instance, these valves, and I think they tried to show them here. So here you can see the valve system in the vein. So basically what a vein looks like is it's going to essentially have a valve that looks like this. So when the blood goes through, it can go forward, but if it tries to fall back down, it's going to close this valve so it can't fall backwards. That's what keeps our blood from basically draining back down to our feet. It keeps it going toward the heart. So let's go ahead and take a look then a little bit more. So the walls of the veins, they, like we mentioned before in the graph, they tend to be thinner in nature, and they're larger in diameter. That is to say, the lumen is larger, so they hold more blood. And so generally speaking, at any given time in the day, you could have almost up to 3/4 of your total blood in your venous system. Generally speaking, if you rupture one of these vessels, then it's a hemorrhage. That's basically where you lose blood. And the nervous system will cause the veins to constrict to increase blood volume to make sure that you keep your blood moving. You have to keep your blood moving. If your blood stops moving, then you are going to die. Oh, excuse me. So now let's take a look at the heart. We took a look at the blood vessels. Now let's take a look at the heart. So the heart basically is a double pump. It's got two sides, a right and a left side. It's going to be basically right in between the lungs, and essentially kind of points a little bit toward the left hip. And essentially, most of it is made up of what's called myocardium. And so this is largely cardiac muscle. And the muscle fibers, we mentioned this before, are branched and they're interconnected with these intercalated discs. We saw that in chapter 4. And important, these intercalated discs are actually areas where you see lots of gap junctions. And the reason is so that the cells can contract in unison. The heart has to contract all at once so that you can get a good, powerful pump and blast that blood out of the heart and get all the way to the tips of your toes, because it's got to go a long ways. So typically speaking, these heart cells are connected by connections called desmosomes, which are a type of adhesion junction. So here's kind of what it looks like. So here's the parts of the heart. So first of all, around the heart, what you're going to see is a little sac called the pericardium, which essentially secretes pericardial fluid for lubrication because your heart's always moving. Internally, if you cut it in half, there's what's called a septum that divides the chambers into right and left sides. It has 4 chambers. We have a 4-chambered heart with 2 atria on the top and 2 ventricles on the bottom. So here's kind of like a surface anatomical view. A couple of things, first of all, to note from this particular one, you can see that you have a couple of different pieces. Things I want to highlight here is, first of all, the right atrium, which is right here. Left atrium is over here. So those are the 2 atria. And then down here, you can see these are the ventricles. And this is the right ventricle we're looking at. The left ventricle is on this side. The septum is right about here, separating the chambers in half. Now, the important thing I like about an image like this is to kind of show you the vasculature of what's going on here. So for instance, right here, you have what's called the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava is down here. So this is basically draining blood from the head and shoulders and into the right atrium, and the inferior vena cava is draining blood from the lower trunk and legs into the right atrium. And then when the heart contracts, these great vessels here are basically receiving the blood. So you can see here you've got the pulmonary trunk, which divides into the pulmonary arteries because they're going away from the heart. Even if they're blue, they're pulmonary arteries. Over here, these little red guys, these are the pulmonary veins. They're basically coming in from the lungs. They've newly picked up oxygen. And then here, this big one, this is going to be the aorta. So this is the base of the aorta here. And then you go to the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta, which goes down the back side of the body. The branches coming off of our aorta are important. So this first one right here is going to be called the brachiocephalic. So brachium basically means arm, cephalic is head. So this is delivering blood to the arm and heads. In the middle is going to be the common carotid artery, which is bringing blood up to the brain. And this one right here, this one is going to be the subclavian. It's going to go right below the clavicle into the left arm. And so those are the major branches that we have. Now let's take a look at a cutaway. So with the cutaway, you can see the insides of the chambers. So for instance, here you can see the big septum. So essentially the pathway of blood, and I'm going to trace this. So let's go ahead and take a look at this as I go through. So blood is going to be coming through from the superior vena cava, and it's going to be draining into the right ventricle, and it's going to be coming into the inferior vena cava and coming into the right ventricle. Then what's going to happen is the atria will contract, and as the blood pools, it'll basically push the blood through this first valve, which is called the right atrioventricular valve, or the tricuspid valve. It'll go through this valve into the left ventricle. I'm going to switch to purple because now I'm on a red background. And so once the blood is in the right ventricle now, the ventricles will contract and the blood will move forward. It can't go backwards because what happens is this piece right here closes during ventricular contraction. So it can't go back, it can't backflow. But it can push open this valve right here, which is called the pulmonary valve, and it'll enter into the pulmonary trunk, where it'll then separate into the right and left pulmonary arteries, going to the right and left lung. So basically out here you get exchange, and then the blood will come back through the pulmonary veins, and then they'll drain. I'm going to go back to red, and they'll drain and fill up the left ventricle. Then what happens is the right atria will contract again. The blood will get pushed through this next valve, which is called the bicuspid or the left AV valve, and it'll fill the left ventricle with blood. Then the left ventricle will contract. Actually, both ventricles contract at the same time, and this will push the blood up through, and you can't see it because it's behind it, through the aorta, and it'll go through the aortic arch, around and back into the body, and then each of these offshoots will go to the arm and head, so that's the brachiocephalic. This one here will go to the brain, the carotids, and this one will go to the left arm and then to the left side of the body. That's essentially the pathway of blood through the heart. And this is kind of a real heart, what a real heart looks like. So you can see it looks very similar to what we just saw. So we have two different types of valves. They're called the semilunar valves. So this is like the pulmonary valve. And we have what's called atrioventricular valves. These are the AV valves. So the AV valves are reinforced by what's called chordae tendineae. So when you take a look at this, the AV valves, basically, their job is to separate the atria from the ventricle. So when you have an AV valve, it looks something like this. It looks like a basketball hoop. And then you see the individual flaps of connective tissue, and then these flaps kind of terminate into these long strings called chordae tendineae. So what these guys do is they basically hold the valve in place. By attaching to the inside of the ventricle with something called papillary muscles. So papillary muscles in the inside of the ventricle, the little ribs of muscle, will attach to the chordae tendineae. And so it anchors the chordae tendineae to the base of the ventricle. That keeps the valve from inverting. So you can't basically push your way back through there. So the left AV valve, which is oftentimes called the bicuspid or the mitral valve, is basically separating left and right ventricle, and the right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve, because it has 3 flaps, is separating the right and left atrium ventricles. The next one we have is the semilunars. The semilunars basically means half moon. And what these guys are is essentially like a series. So if you take a look at it, it looks something like this. So here's a moon, here's a moon. They look something like this. These like little half moons, little half moon flaps. They look kind of like that if you look at them end on. And so you have 2 different types. You have the pulmonary valve, which we saw here. So that's the pulmonary valve. So that's separating the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. And then the aortic valve basically separates the left ventricle from the aorta. And so you'll see that one. We didn't see that one on here. It should be like up tucked underneath here. So if we kind of removed all this, it would be like right in there somewhere. So ultimately then, that's essentially what happens when, so those are the valves. Basically the valve's job is to create one-way blood flow. So the job of the valves, it prevents backflow. You can't go backwards in the heart. You can only go forwards. And that's what the valves do. Now, we know that there's myocardium, that is cardiac muscle, in the heart, and that's what it does. But it's a muscle, so it needs its own blood supply. It needs food and nutrients just like anybody else. And so what we have in the heart is what's called the coronary system. So the coronary arteries, these guys basically are the arteries and veins that feed the heart muscle. So the coronary arteries will bring nutrients to the myocardium. And so they are the very first things that come off of the aorta. And the coronary veins will drain it and empty it right back into the right atrium. Generally speaking, when you go to the cardiologist to have like a nuclear stress test done, they want to check for blockage and things like that. You're looking for CAD, coronary artery disease, which is essentially a blockage in one of these coronary arteries. And if you block a coronary artery, you're going to deprive your heart of blood, and it's going to create what's called a myocardial infarction, which is essentially a heart attack. Basically, you're blocking nutrients and oxygen in particular from your heart muscle, and they simply just can't contract, and then your heart stops pumping. And then that's basically how you die of a heart attack. So we kind of already sketched out the passage of blood through the heart. So I want to go through this piece quickly because we already did a lot of it, right? So we basically are going to be delivered to the right atrium through the vena cava, both inferior and superior, carrying waste and oxygen, poor CO2-rich blood. The right atrium will contract. It's always atria, ventricle, atria, ventricle. Both atria contract at the same time. And so when the right atrium contracts, the blood goes through the right AV, or the tricuspid, into the right ventricle. And then at that point, the right ventricle will contract, sending the blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, which will then take the blood through the right and left pulmonary arteries to the lungs so they can exchange the CO2 for oxygen and so forth. And then what's going to happen is it's going to come back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. They have now basically picked up a fresh batch of oxygen, and they've gotten rid of or dumped their CO2. So that's coming into the left atrium. Then both atria are going to contract again. It's going to send the blood through the left AV valve or the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Either one of those are synonymous. And it's going to be moving into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, the ventricle is going to contract again. And then from there, the blood is going to go push its way through the aortic valve into the aorta. And then basically it's going to get delivered to the body. And then from then, the aorta basically will branch through the smaller and smaller arteries, which ultimately will lead to arterioles and then to capillaries, and then they'll be picked up from venules and veins, and then back to the vena cava. So you can see it's a big circle. From the heart, you go to the arteries, from the arteries to the arterioles, from the arterioles to the capillaries. You do your exchange, nutrients and waste and oxygen, and then you get picked up by the venules and then moved into the veins, and then you make your way back to the vena cava, and then you get redistributed back to the heart to get refreshed and redelivered. So it's a constant cycle. So a couple of functional details. Generally speaking, the left side, the left ventricle, is bigger and thicker than the right side, mostly because of what it has to do. It has to get blood to the entire body, so it's a little more muscular. The right side just has to get it next door to the lung. Remember, the lungs are sitting right next door. So the right side doesn't have to be so big because it doesn't have to go as far. Generally speaking, when you take a look at the walls of the atria, the atrial walls are thinner than the ventricles. Why? Because they don't have to pump blood as far. Your pulmonary capillaries, which are in the lungs, allow for gas exchange, and that's where you're going to get your gas entering into the blood. So your oxygen enters the blood, CO2 leaves the blood, and then basically you recharge your blood. Now that kind of leads us then, because it's a cyclic thing, right? So from heart to arteries to capillaries to veins to heart, back to arteries again, and so forth, back and forth. Then what we have is what's called a cardiac cycle. So cardiac cycle is basically going from the first atrial contraction, right? Your very first atrial contraction, all the way to the next atrial contraction. So it's like from one atrial contraction to the next, and the events that happen within that. Generally speaking, as the atria are contracting, they contract together at the same time, right? So they basically contract together. The ventricles in the heart typically are relaxing. When the ventricles contract at the same time, the atria are relaxing. So this kind of alternate cycle of contraction relaxation, we put a name on it. We call one systole. So systole is heart contraction, the contraction of the heart. Diastole is the relaxation of the heart. Generally speaking, on average, and of course this is different from one individual to the next, about you get a cycle about 70 times per minute, roughly, basically your heart rate. And when you put a stethoscope up to it, you can actually hear the sounds, the lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. There's actually multiple sounds you can hear with the stethoscope, but those two are the most pronounced. And what those are is the lub of the lub-dub is when the AV valves close. And when are they doing this? During ventricular contraction or ventricular systole. Because the ventricles, when they push, they'll push that valve closed, and then they can only go forward. The dub is the closure of the semilunar valves. Typically, this is after ventricular systole. So that's normal. So a murmur is basically a swishing sound between the lub and the dub. So for instance, it'll be lub, swish, dub, lub, swish, dub. And this is typically what's called regurgitation or a leaky valve. Basically what that means is there's backflow going on. And it's not necessarily catastrophic. It depends on how bad it is. But you know, your heart can tolerate probably a little bit of inefficiency when it comes to regurgitation. It just can't be excessive, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get enough blood out to your body. So this is kind of like the stages of the cardiac cycle. So we're going to start off, first of all, with A. So notice right here, the first thing right here is you get atrial systole, contraction of the atria. So you can see the atria are contracting. It's pushing the blood into the ventricles, and it's filling up the ventricles. The next step then is going to be B, here I am, sorry. The next piece is going to be the contraction of the ventricles. So now we have ventricular systole. So as the ventricles contract, these guys are in a relaxation state, the atria. So when you squeeze it, it's like squeezing a dropper bottle. When you squeeze the blood, both ventricles are contracting. So you can see that both ventricles are contracting. What happens is as they're squeezing on the blood wants to go right back through that AV valve, but it can't, because what happens is because these chordae tendineae are attached to the inside of the ventricle wall, when the blood tries to go backwards, it basically slams this valve shut so that it can't backflow. That is the lub that we hear in the lub dub. So the only way that the blood can go now when it's being pushed is through the semilunar valve. Now then, as blood has gone through the semilunar valve, what happens is there's a shift in pressure. So instead of the pressure being so strong to open up this valve, what happens is the pressure reduces, and then pretty soon the pressure in the pulmonary trunk is greater than what's in the empty now, right? This is now an empty ventricle. So what happens is the blood wants to start falling back through, just like by gravity, but it can't, because what will happen is as soon as it hits this semilunar valve, the semilunar valve closes, snaps shut. That's the dub. And then while that's happening, this right atrium is filling up with blood for the next cycle. And so is the left atrium, by the way. And here then you also have, let me kind of write this. So this would be atrial diastole. So they are relaxing while the ventricles are contracting. And at this point, you have now the ventricles have finished contracting and you got ventricular diastole. So now they're relaxing. This is a great image. I love this image. This shows you exactly what the aortic valve looks like. You can see it's very much, you can see these three flaps, these little half moon flaps that basically close off that aorta. It's a very, very good image, very good shot. Okay, now how do you control the cardiac cycle? Well, there's a conduction system in the heart. So the conduction system in the heart is essentially kind of an electrical conduction system. And it's driven by what's called an SA node, a sinoatrial node. That's what this stands for, sinoatrial. And basically what this is this is a little patch of cells in the right atrium. And its job is to initiate the heartbeat by sending out an electrical signal. And then this basically causes the atria to contract. Oftentimes we refer to the SA node as the heart's pacemaker. So this is what sets down your heartbeat. Now what happens is from the SA node, once the SA node sends out the signal, it sends it to another node called the AV node, which is the atrioventricular node. Also in the right atrium, but kind of a little lower down. The AV node's job is to basically send the signal down what's called the AV bundle, which moves into the ventricles and then terminates in these like little neural twigs, these fibers called Purkinje fibers. And what these guys do is they'll basically infiltrate all the nooks and crannies of the myocardium to make sure that there's nobody who's left out of the communication loop. So this delivers the contraction signal to the ventricles and then they contract. Now, the reason why they can contract in unison is because these impulses are traveling through gap junctions. And remember, gap junctions interconnect all of the myocardium. So it's kind of what it looks like. So first of all, here you can see the SA node in the upper portion of the right atrium. setting down the pace. It'll send out the signal, first of all, to other atrial tissue to contract. And so you can see it's sending it both to its own atrium in the right atrium, but it's also sending it through to the left atrium to contract, where both atria contract at the same time. And then it's also sending that message to the AV node. So here's your AV node a little further down. And its job is to process that information, and then it sends it into the AV bundle. So this is basically the AV bundle right here. So it starts off in the right atrium, and then it enters into the septum, this muscular wall separating right and left ventricle. It enters into the septum, and then as soon as it enters into the septum, it divides into right and left, what's called bundle branches. So the right bundle branch will wrap around the apex of the right wall, the lateral wall of the right ventricle. The left bundle branch will wrap around the left lateral wall of the left ventricle. And then coming off of this bundle branch are all these like little fibers that basically interject themselves into all the nooks and crannies of everywhere where there's muscle. Those are the Purkinje fibers, making sure that everybody is getting the message. Now, that's kind of your intrinsic control, your internal control. Now, what about external? Well, first of all, the reason why internal or intrinsic is important is because the signal that the SA nodes basically is spontaneous. Has spontaneous firing, which is unusual for a neuron, right? Because there's not another nerve telling the SA node to turn on. The SA node just like automatically just starts going. Like it just automatically fires, like boom, 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 boom. There's nobody telling it to do that. It just automatically does that metronomically. Now, what we have in terms of external control is control over this already automatically firing SA node. And so in your brain, you have cardiac control centers. These are regions of your brain that will allow you to be able to control not whether you do a heart rate, but it increases, or heartbeat, but it increases the rate, right? So it doesn't, what these guys don't do is it doesn't tell the heart to beat. It tells it to either speed up or to slow down. It's an accelerator. And so we have nervous centers in the brain, regions of the brain that basically are in control of that. We also have the endocrine system plays a role. So there's hormones that will actually increase our heart rate as well. Those of you who are adrenaline junkies know this all too well. So one of the ways that we can record the cardiac cycle is through an EKG or an ECG, which is essentially a recording of the electrical changes that are occurring as your heart basically goes through a cardiac cycle. And basically, as your heart goes through this sort of cycle, the cycle of systole and diastole, they send off electrical signals that we can then read out. For instance, the atria produce an electrical current that is basically stimulated by the SA node called the P wave. So that's basically associated with the atria getting ready to contract, that signaling process. Then right after that is a complex curve called the QRS complex, which is essentially a wave of different types of electrical activities that are happening that are moving through the ventricles. And so this is typically where the ventricles are contracting, but it's also where the atria typically are relaxing. So there's a couple of things going on in the QRS wave. And then the recovery or the relaxation of the ventricles is given to us by the T wave. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here you can see in an EKG, this is basically where the atria start. So the atria, the change is associated with atrial contraction. That happens at the P wave. Right after that, that signal is going to go to the ventricles. And so that's going to be your QRS. So here basically now you have the atria that are relaxing and the ventricles are going to be getting ready to contract. So these are the electrical signals associated with communicating the ventricles to contract. And then the T wave is basically ventricular relaxation. This is where they're relaxing themselves. So what happens when your heart rate goes awry? Then you get something that looks like B. This is ventricular fibrillation. So you can see that basically what you have is what looks like a whole host of random sort of ventricular contractions, just, boom, boom, boom. There's no rhyme or rhythm. You're kind of out of rhythm. And that's typically a bad situation. So this is actually what heart failure looks like. It doesn't look like flatline. It looks like ventricular fibrillation. This is one where you want to get out the paddles and you want to shock your pacemaker system back into sinus rhythm. That's what you're looking for. So the reason why we like EKGs is because we can detect abnormalities in our pumping system. For instance, we just saw ventricular fibrillation, which is essentially just random ventricle firing. So the ventricles don't know what to do. And so when it's doing this, it's not uniform. The heart can't pump blood. The tissues can't get oxygen, so they starve. And then pretty soon you're just going to die. Okay. And so at that point, what we do is defibrillation, which is essentially just shocking your electrical system and overriding. It's like a reset. So basically this resets the SA node. And a lot of times that's all you need. Just reset that SA node and the heart will take over. It knows what to do. Okay. So now let's go ahead and move into blood pressure. So blood pressure basically is the blood, or the pressure that blood is pushing up against blood vessel walls. The highest point of blood pressure is going to be in the aorta because the left ventricle just basically has blasted blood right into that aorta because it's right next to the heart. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So it's going to be high pressure there. And then it decreases as it moves through. So as it goes through arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, and finally to the veins, it decreases in pressure. And it's the lowest pressure in your superior and inferior vena cava, which is right next to the right atrium. So when you take a look at measuring different things, we have obviously pulse, right? We always take your pulse, which is essentially when we feel the pulse, it's essentially the feeling of the blood that's surging into the artery, causing pressure. So the blood will cause those arterial walls to stretch, and we'll feel that stretch underneath our finger. That's what we feel when we feel the blood pulsing through our veins. And so oftentimes we'll measure it through the radial artery. That's basically the one where we grab our wrist, or the carotid artery. That's one where we basically do it in the neck. And so generally speaking, we can get a good idea of where basically our number of cardiac cycle rates are, our number of beats per minute, depending on what we're doing. Now, blood flow, as you might well imagine, is highly regulated, right? So basically, the ventricles will create blood pressure because you have to push that blood throughout your body and through the arteries. And we can measure this blood pressure through basically a sphygmomanometer, which is the fancy name for a blood pressure cuff. And so what we do is we're basically measuring the brachial artery. What we really want to know is we want to know what the blood pressure is inside the ventricles, but we can't get to that. So what we do is we use the most accessible artery that is close to the heart to be able to see that. And so what we basically do in blood pressure is we essentially put the cuff on there and we use the pressure to sort of determine what the pressure of the blood is. The idea, we use essentially Newton's laws of motion, right? So for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when we put pressure on our blood vessel with the cuff, then what will happen is the pressure that's inside the blood vessel will resist what we're doing. So it doesn't want to be crushed down, and we're flattening the blood vessel. And so we'll actually be able to sort of feel that push against the cuff. And that's kind of what the cuff is doing. It's basically applying an opposite pressure in order to match what's inside your blood. And then we can read that. So when we do our blood pressure, we'll have two different numbers. We'll have systolic pressure. So this is the highest pressure. This is typically associated with blood that's basically being ejected from the heart. So this is the high pressure piece. And then the diastolic, which is a lower pressure number, is when the ventricles are relaxing. So oftentimes we see blood pressure as a two-number system. So like 120/80, for instance, which is systolic on the top and diastolic on the bottom. And by this, we can basically sort of determine whether or not somebody has, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, whatever. And so if they have high blood pressure, it's hypertension. If they have low blood pressure, it's hypotension. And so when you go to the doctor's office, is what they do. So an inflatable cuff will basically what it'll do is it'll take your brachial artery, and what you're trying to do with the cuff is you basically are pumping it full of air, and the blood with its pressure is flowing through the brachial artery. So what happens is the pressure in the cuff will basically close off the brachial artery. You'll kind of pinch it closed, and then when you release it, so that's the closed area, right? So there's no sounds of blood going through there, because typically what happens is the blood that's going through your arteries is what's called laminar flow. It's smooth flow. So what happens is as you slowly release, then you're going to start to get a little bit of opening. And as you kind of open it a little bit, then what's going to happen is the blood is going to start squirting through. But when it does, it creates turbulent flow, basically kind of swishes through, and you can hear that swishing as the sounds of your heartbeat. And that's associated with the pressure. That's the pressure at which it starts. So that's the high pressure piece. And then the low pressure piece is when it opens up, and then the sounds stop because it's restored smooth, silent, laminar flow. Okay, and so when the sounds begin, that's your systole number. And when the sounds disappear, that's your diastole number. So when you take a look at blood pressure values, for instance, typically normal blood pressure systolically is about 120 or below, or 80 or below is what we like to see on the diastolic side of things. If it's somewhat elevated, you're going to be in the 20s. If it's stage 1 hypertension, it'll be in the 30s, or your diastolic will be moving above 80, getting close to the 90s. If you're stage 2 hypertension, it's going to be above 140, or it's going to be over 90 on your diastolic. If it's a situation where we need to get you taken care of, it's going to be on in the upper hundreds. It's for both. So you're going to have something over 100 for diastolic. Okay, so one of the things that's really concerning about blood pressure is not that it's high, is that it stays high. It has to persist, right? Because remember, blood pressure is constantly changing throughout the day. So you'll have high peaks, spikes of blood pressure, but typically they're supposed to come down. So when we're talking about concerns here, we're talking about chronic blood pressure. That is to say that it's always high, right? And the other one is high numbers over here are worse than systolic. Why? Because this is supposed to be relaxed. What this is telling us, if you have a diastolic 120, that means that even when your artery is open and it's smooth and it's supposed to be in its low pressure state, it's really high pressure, right? So this basically means it's high even when it's supposed to be relaxed. Okay. So this kind of shows you a little bit also how blood pressure and blood velocity, or the speed of blood flow through the vessels, changes. For instance, as you start to move through our system, so we start with arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins. So in the arteries, you can see you have basically a high blood pressure at the beginning because of the heart pump. But as it goes through to arterioles, that pressure goes down. The pressure continues to go down into capillaries, and it kind of goes a little bit lesser as you get into venules and veins. The blood velocity will do a similar sort of a thing. So it'll be higher in the arteries, and then it'll reduce in the arterioles. It'll get the slowest in the capillaries, and then it'll pick up. It'll speed up again in the veins, and it'll increase so that you can deliver that venous blood back to the heart. The cross-sectional area, what does that mean? That basically means the difference is over here, cross-sectional area-wise, you have an artery that looks like this. Whereas with the capillaries, you have it look like this. You have all these little capillary vessels. So that's greater cross-sectional area. So when you have these large open areas, you have low cross-sectional area in the veins and in the arteries, but you have high cross-sectional area in the capillaries. That's because you have to exchange a lot of stuff. And so you want to be able to have a lot of working surface area to exchange it. So that's basically kind of how it works between blood flow and blood pressure. So in the capillaries, blood flow is slow, right? Your blood pressure will decrease as it flows away from the heart, and it's the slowest in the capillaries. And the reason why is because you want to increase exchange, right? So you don't want to go so fast through the capillaries that you can't just exchange your gases and your nutrients and your wastes. But at the same time, you want to keep it moving, right? So you can control this blood flow and the speed with these precapillary sphincters, increasing it by closing it, decreasing it by opening it, and so forth. So the blood flow and the blood speed through the capillaries is critical. Think of it as like if you're a paper route, right? And you're sort of driving by and you throw the paper. You don't want to go so fast that you have no hope whatsoever of hitting the house, right? You want to go slow enough to where you can throw the paper at the house, but not so slow that you can't get the route done. Now, blood flow in the veins basically has to return the blood back to the heart. So even though your pressure is lowest here in the veins, your velocity actually speeds up. And so your venous return is basically an important piece because we have to basically get this blood back to the heart. And so there's three different things that allows us to be able to do this. The reason why the venous blood is increases in velocity is because of these three. First of all, there's what's called a skeletal pump. Essentially, what a skeletal pump is this right here. So you have skeletal muscles that are next to your veins. And so what happens is the blood in your veins, when your skeletal muscles contract, it basically squeezes the veins and pushes the blood through these little valve systems up to the next chamber. When your muscles relax, the blood tries to come back down because gravity's pulling it down, but it can't because these valves close. And so next time you contract, you send the next bit of blood up the body. This is basically kind of what you're doing when you're kind of massaging your muscles. Oftentimes what you're doing is you're squeezing on those veins and you're getting and facilitating the flow of venous blood. The other one are the valves. We just talked about the valves. The important way of the valves basically is the valves create one-way blood flow. So once you get the blood up to the upper chamber, you don't let it fall back down. Everything would pool in your feet if you did that, right? So these valves basically keep it from falling back down and keeps it one way. The other big one is a respiratory pump. Basically what the respiratory pump does is essentially the changes in pressure in your thoracic cavity. This is due to breathing. Creates a negative pressure in the cavity that pulls up the venous blood. Basically what happens is because of the rise and fall of pressures in your thoracic cavity due to your breathing in and breathing out, you create a negative pressure space inside your thoracic cavity that essentially then communicates to the pressures inside your veins and effectively basically pulls that up. It's basically the same physics as what happens when you suck fluids or suck a drink through a straw. What you do is you vacate the pressure just above the fluid level in your straw. That creates negative pressure, like a suction, basically, which then causes the pressure of the fluid to move upward to fill in that negative space. So moving fluid up a straw is basically the same thing as the respiratory pump. Okay, now let's take a look at some cardiovascular pathways. So we're going to take a look at the pulmonary circuit versus the systemic circuit. So the flow of blood through these two different circuits. The pulmonary circuit is basically circulation of blood through the lungs. The systemic circuit is going to be circulating blood throughout to the body tissues. And so this is kind of what you see. So your systemic circuit is essentially going to be the left side. So it's going to go basically from the heart out to the body, to organs of various sorts, to capillary beds of various sorts, and then it's going to be collected on the pulmonary circuit, where it gets collected in the veins and it gets delivered back to the heart, which then puts it into the lungs for recharging and brings it back to the heart. So basically, you kind of have this big sort of figure eight. So the right atrium is going to basically pump deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle, which is then basically going to be pumping that into the pulmonary trunk for delivery to the lungs. The pulmonary trunk is going to be splitting into the two pulmonary arteries, which goes to the lungs. And in the lungs, the pulmonary arteries will basically branch into arterioles, and then they'll go into the pulmonary capillaries where you're going to get gas exchange. So you're going to be dropping off CO2 and you're going to be picking up oxygen. The reason why I'm going so fast for this is because we've already talked through this process a couple of times already at this point in the chapter. Then what's going to happen is those pulmonary capillaries are basically going to, after they're finished exchanging, are going to basically be recollected in the venules of the capillary, which will then merge into the pulmonary veins. Now that's nice and oxygenated. Those full pulmonary veins will then empty into the left atrium, and then ultimately get redelivered for the systemic side. So the pulmonary arteries, when you take a look at them, are basically carrying oxygen-poor blood, and the pulmonary veins are carrying oxygen-rich blood. This is the reason why I always mention that always remember that arteries away and you'll never go astray. In the systemic circuit, now you are in the left atrium. So the left ventricle will then receive that blood that's newly oxygenated in the left ventricle, which will then contract and send that blood through the aorta, which will then go off into the various branches of the aorta to the different tissues of the body. And then it'll branch eventually into the arterioles. It'll go through a few steps, but it'll go into the arterioles, which will then lead to the capillaries of specific tissues. And then from the capillaries, and you'll basically get your exchange, and then you'll basically recollect it into the venules, which will drain in the veins, which will then moving up to the superior and inferior vena cava by doing those three mechanisms, right? The valve system, the skeletal contraction system, and also the respiratory pump. And that's basically moving the venous blood back to the heart, where essentially the vena cava will empty into the right atrium to start it all over again. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So basically you have the right side and the left side, and you have all these arteries and blood vessels that are basically kind of infusing the entire body. So the blood that's flowing into the aorta will essentially go and supply most of the organs, and then they will be kind of fed back. So this is kind of the order from aorta to the renal artery, for instance, for the kidneys, which will basically feed blood to the kidneys. Then you'll have a renal vein that will basically collect the blood after it goes through the capillary, and it'll recollect into the inferior vena cava. However, there are a couple of variations to this theme. What's called a hepatic portal system, or a portal system. And a portal system, basically any kind of a portal system, I'm going to describe this first of all. A portal system is essentially a system where two capillary beds are connected by a shortcut, by a portal vein or a portal vessel. So generally speaking, whenever you're going from your heart to a capillary bed, you have to go from the heart through your artery system to the arterioles to the capillaries. And then once they go to the capillaries, you have to go through the venules, back through the veins, back through the heart. And if you want to go to another capillary bed, you have to go all the way back to the heart and get redistributed through the heart. And then you have to go to the other capillary bed that you wanted to go to. That's the way you have to go. You always have to go back through the heart and then be redistributed. A portal system basically is a shortcut where you can move blood directly from one capillary bed to another through this portal system. That's what the hepatic portal system does. What the hepatic portal system does is basically it takes nutrient-rich blood that you've just absorbed from your digestive tract, and then what will happen is it'll bring that blood directly into the liver without going through the heart. And so that's the shortcut. So you're not going through the heart. You're basically taking all of these amino acids and things like that, and it basically dumps it into the liver. The liver will metabolize this. It'll remove toxins if you've eaten toxins, pathogens, and so forth. And then the blood is then at that point released into the hepatic veins, which then dump into the inferior vena cava. So you can think of everything you eat and put in your mouth goes through your liver first, which is one of the reasons why taking lots of chronic medications gives you cirrhotic liver. Non-alcohol induced cirrhotic liver is because of that extra work the liver is doing. Okay, so let's take a look at the exchange piece. Right, there's two main forces that are driving fluids into and out of capillaries. It's all driven by blood pressure, right? So the pressure of the blood is going to be driving fluid out of the capillaries, typically at the arterial end of the capillary bed. Osmotic pressure draws water in. So osmotic pressure basically is the ability of salts to suck water into it. So salt sucks, right? So salt sucks that water in, so that osmotic pressure will draw water into the capillary. And this is mostly happening at the venule end. Now, any excess fluid that's laying around is typically going to be mopped up by the lymphatic capillaries and introduced into the lymph system. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here's our arterial end. So we have blood pressure basically that's coming through the heart, and then it's going to be moving into the capillary system. But because the blood pressure is high at the arterial end, it's going to be pushing fluid and nutrients and anything small that can get out. It's going to be pushing it out into the tissues where they need it, right? So you're going to have water coming out as well. You're going to have oxygen coming out as well, amino acids coming out as well. So this is coming out into your interstitial fluid. The inward forces, these little green arrows, is the osmotic pull. So the desire of the saltiness of the blood inside wanting to pull it in. So as you go through the capillary, you'll notice that you have a diminishing pressure of water being pushed out. So there's less and less water being pushed out, so you can see by these smaller arrows. And as you go through, there's more and more osmotic tension inside the vessels. That is to say, the reason is because as the water leaves on the arterial end, what's going to happen is that it leaves behind all those molecules, kind of like concentrated, right? It kind of evaporates off and concentrates it. And so that concentration of different molecules inside the cell creates a saltiness that then creates this sort of sucking effect. And so you can see the water now is getting sucked in because of these left behind solutes. And now you're going to have water moving into and waste moving into and carbon dioxide moving into the venule side. So you can kind of see the switch. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this is actually a real capillary. So you can see, well, not a cartoon, but capillary. So you can see the blood's going to be coming in. It's going to go through the capillary bed. The sphincter muscles will determine which avenue it goes down. But you can see it's going to exchange. And as it exchanges, you get to kind of this transition zone here. That's the purple zone. And then eventually it's going to get to the venule side where it'll actually pick that up. In amongst it, you'll also see these lymphatic ducts, right? So these lymphatic ducts basically are there to pick up excess fluid. So any excess fluid that is just sort of lingering around that you need to mop up is going to be directly moved into these lymphatic tissues. That's to keep your tissues from swelling. So these lymphatic capillaries are kind of intertwined in there. And that's kind of what a capillary looks like. So what about some cardiovascular disorders? Well, first of all, we have cardiovascular disease, right, which is one of the leading causes of death in most Western countries. And you have disorders of blood vessels, right? So basically hypertension, for instance, high blood pressure, it's typically caused by what's called atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries. It's plaque development on the inside of your arteries, closing them off. Stroke basically is where you lose blood to a region of the brain. Heart attack is when you lose blood to a region of the heart. And aneurysm is when you have a burst blood vessel and you basically bleed out like almost instantaneously. So let's take a look at each one of these. So hypertension, basically, if you're in the 140s, that's high blood pressure. It's called the silent killer because oftentimes there's very few symptoms associated with that. But over time, it'll have a lot of wear and tear in your cardiovascular system, which will cause kidney failure. It'll also cause heart attack or stroke. And so typically when we take a look at this, you have to take blood pressure medication, which is typically treated with diuretics. So basically these offload water. To reduce blood pressure because most of your blood is made up of water. We'll learn that in the next chapter. And so you urinate off more water to kind of keep that blood pressure down. Atherosclerosis is essentially the plaquing of the inside of your blood vessel walls. And so when you take a look at the inside of your blood vessel walls, the liner will actually start to develop this kind of fatty plaque. And then what happens is as the blood comes through, it hits this little fatty plaque, creates a lot of turbulence and resistance and pressure. That adds to your blood pressure. And then if it gets too thick, it's going to start closing off the actual artery, and it could cause heart attack. They can also break off and form clots, which could then lodge in an artery somewhere and block the flow of blood, which could kill you. So a thrombus is basically a clot that's staying put. An embolus is a clot that detaches and moves around, typically to distant sites. And a thromboembolism is an embolus, that is to say, a moving clot that has typically become lodged in a blood vessel. And whether or not this kills you depends on whether or not it's allowing blood through that vessel or not. Right. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here's your fatty plaque. So you can see how it's closing off the diameter of the blood vessel, and it's disrupting flow. So this is an actual micrograph of the plaque itself. So here's your atherosclerotic plaque. So you can see how you have a diminishment in the diameter and the amount of blood that's able to come through there. And so you have to be very careful, because if that occludes too much, it could cause heart attack. So stroke, or CVA, which stands for cerebral vascular accident, is basically when a cranial artery is either blocked, that deprives blood flow, or a burst, which also deprives blood flow. Both, right? Because of the deprivation of blood flow, a portion of your brain loses oxygen and then it dies. And that's basically where we get the symptoms of stroke. For instance, the numbness, speaking, coordination, the inability to see in one eye, things like that. So this is just depends on which region of the brain and how much of the region of the brain was damaged. Strokes can be very different that way. Then, of course, heart attack, myocardial infarction is essentially when you block blood flow to the heart muscle. And so once you block a coronary artery, typically you have a heart attack because your hearts can't contract anymore. Sometimes, but not all the time, it starts with angina pectoris, which is essentially chest pain. So if you happen to be lucky and you only have a partially blocked coronary artery, so you might sense this, and a lot of people will do this if they survive a heart attack, is they'll feel chest pain and they'll go into the doctor and they'll realize they have a partially blocked artery, and they got lucky. And so we can treat this with blood vessel dilators, to kind of open up that artery so that you can get better blood flow around that partial blockage. And so depending on the nature of the blockage, you'll have different types of treatment plans associated with that. And that's the reason why you go to a cardiologist, to determine just what kinds of treatments you need based on what kind of blockage you're looking at. An aneurysm is basically just a bulge in a blood vessel. So for instance, if you have a blood vessel and the wall kind of bulges out, almost kind of blisters out like that, that's an aneurysm. Now, if that gets too strong, what can happen is that bulge can rupture, and typically it's almost always an instant death situation, because generally speaking, these most often are in the large vessels, the abdominal aorta, or like the blood vessels in the brain. So this is like one of those things where once the blood vessel pops, or the abdominal aorta, it's like you're alive and functioning 1 second, and then the very next second, boom, you just drop dead, like just boom, out of nowhere. That's oftentimes how aneurysms will work once they rupture. And so what can cause this? Well, the wall of the artery is oftentimes weakened when you start developing significant plaquing in that area. It weakens the arterial wall, which causes it to bulge, and then it becomes a problem. Or hypertension can also weaken the blood vessel because of chronic wear and tear on it, and that can cause an aneurysm as well. And then ultimately, the final piece of that is the rupturing of the wall itself. So dissolving blood clots, right? So for thromboembolism, remember this is the moving embolism that basically becomes lodged in your blood vessel. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll use different types of medical treatments. We'll use what's called TPA, which is tissue plasminogen activator. So this is an anti-blood clot medication. So better known as a blood thinner, to help the blood to move more easily past that embolism, to keep it from coagulating or clotting up. And so we'll basically do, so what this day basically does is we learned a little bit about the clotting process. And what we realized is that plasminogen, which is an inactive form of an enzyme called plasmin, is an enzyme that naturally dissolves blood clots. So once we've actually developed a blood clot and we have to, we're done and we have to kind of break down the blood clot, we have an entire system where we can turn this enzyme on, plasmin, that will dissolve our blood clots. And so what happens is we have different types of medications that will either simulate or stimulate plasmin to break down those blood clots and sort of break them up. The other one is aspirin, which is a blood dilator. And so it also helps to reduce clot formation and coagulation, especially once an attack starts to begin. It'll keep the blood flowing so it'll keep you alive, right? This is one of the reasons why a lot of times cardiology patients will be told by their doctors that as soon as you feel chest pain, just pop an aspirin, because the idea is that'll keep the blood flowing and give you some time to sort of survive the event and give you some time to get to the doctor so they can really do a full checkout on you. And so that's so how about clogged arteries, right? What happens if you have a lot of plaquing? So if you have a lot of plaquing, what do you do about it? Well, first of all, one of the things you can do is a bypass operation, right? Where you basically take a vein, oftentimes from the leg, and you bypass a clogged artery. So for instance, if this is your artery and it's clogged, what you can do is basically graft a vein to basically bypass the blockage. So the blood will go basically through this bypass and then still flow through. And so that's common. So gene therapy is something where you can inject a gene for a growth factor for blood vessels to grow new blood vessels. And so sometimes you can do that. Or angioplasty is basically where you stick kind of like a balloon into a clogged artery and you blow it up and you put a stent in there, which is kind of like a collar, kind of a hard mesh collar, and you put the stent in there to open it up. And so it's kind of hollow. And what this does is it basically holds the artery open and allows the blood to basically flow through the stent. And so it'll oftentimes also dissolve blockages because they'll have like medication on them to dissolve those blockages. And this is kind of what it looks like. So here's our balloon putting in a stent. So you kind of put the balloon in there, you blow up the artery, and then you kind of place the stent and you pull out your pump, for lack of a better term. So ultimately then, once you finally reach the point where you have heart failure, that's when your pump no longer operates properly. And so what we do at that point is we wrap the heart to prevent it from enlarging. We oftentimes will put in an ICD, which is a cardioverter defibrillator. Basically, if it's an arrhythmia, we can use this to sort of shock or constantly shock the heart back into rhythm. Heart transplant, if it's really, really shot and really gone, if there's too much damage to the heart to repair it. Stem cells, this is a little bit more cutting edge to repair the damaged heart. LVAD is basically a mechanical device that you stick in there to do the pumping for you. And then a total artificial heart would be just a completely mechanical heart, like all the way around, all four chambers. And LVAD is just a left ventricle. It kind of helps to do the pumping of the left ventricle itself. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here's your replacement heart. You kind of stick this big old kind of machine looking structure in there and you connect it to the vessels so that it essentially is doing what your heart would do. It's just doing it mechanically. And so kind of like a dialysis machine, where the dialysis machine for somebody with kidney failure is basically doing the same the same work that your kidneys would have done. It's just that the machine is cleaning up the blood, and that's basically your cardiovascular system, at least the heart and blood vessels.